Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Kap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome everybody to Season 4, Episode 20 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. We give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 4 and the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Kap. Nick's done a great job of holding down the fort while I was out in California. It was a wonderful trip. Got some fun souvenirs here. So that's nice. This thing lights up. That's pretty sweet. Football didn't exist to me. My fantasy team stunk it up, but it didn't matter because I was at Disneyland. My players all injured. Doesn't matter. I was at Disneyland. I scored points in leagues that I should have won my matchups, but didn't. Didn't matter because I was in Disneyland. So kudos to Nick for holding down the fort. Hopefully you all joined him for that live show on Sunday. I woke up and I was going to join the live show, Nick, and it was 6:30 a.m. LA time. I think you had already been signed off, but I was like, all right, I'm going back to bed. So Nick held down the fort for the live show. Hopefully you joined him and enjoyed that. And if you're coming and watching the show now, thank you so much for doing that. Nick also gave you guys a good episode on Tuesday. 10 takeaways instead of just 5 from him. I know he ripped some players and talked about some stuff that I would have talked about as well. So good job on Nick's part for that. But it is episode 20. It is we're recording on Thursday, September 26th before Thursday Night Football. There's a lot to talk about. Our all boom and all bust teams, as we always do for you in this episode. Injuries are affecting our teams a little bit, I think, at least with my takes. But that's okay. And that's kind of the part of the fantasy season that we're into, Nick. And I think there's more injuries this year than it feels like before, but maybe it just feels like that because football is gone for a while.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And it does feel like every team is battered in some way or form. But we'll get into that on our all boom and all bust team. So if it's your first time listening or watching to this show, thank you so much. You get 2 shows from us weekly, available on all social media platforms, plus our YouTube channel, which you should be subscribed to. And then we do a live show Sunday mornings, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, available on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. The best place to get your comments and questions in on the show is the YouTube. You could see the list of questions so you know where you are in the queue as we're giving insightful responses to other people. And we can actually flash your question up on the screen. So make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast, and then join us at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time for our Week 4 live show so we can help you with your fantasy football teams. You can also follow us and interact with us on all social media platforms. Make sure to check us out. We are everywhere. Okay, so we're going to start things off with our all boom teams. So as some of you guys know, we do have an anonymous source that we send our all boom and all bust teams to. I've had a crazy week coming back from Cali, going back to work, hurricane coming tonight. So with all that said, what normally happens is I'll send my all boom team and Nick will send his all bust team, and then we'll swap each week, and then one of us will have to kind of flip the players, that our source tells us that we have to flip. I didn't admit this week, again, a little bit crazy. So I actually let Nick get first dibs on both teams. I think I only had to flip 2 players. I think they were both busts, and I only had to flip 2 players. So we have completely different teams and completely different players that we don't know. So let's get into it, Nick. Who is your all boom quarterback for Week 4?
Now that you said that, one of my favorite things is when you have someone on the all boom and I have them on the all bust, or the other way around, and like one of us has to be right? Like we both can't be wrong. So
sure.
We'll get into it. I'm gonna go, and I don't know if this is a cop out because I don't know if you're allowed to use a guy that's ranked this high, but I'm going with the QB2 on the season, Jaden Daniels. I don't think
it's a cop out, but because he's a rookie and because he's a lot of backups for a lot of teams. I know somebody that just had Jaden Daniels as his backup for. Actually, I'll say his name because you know him. Our buddy Chris. He had Jalen Hurts as a starting quarterback, and he had Jaden Daniels as his backup. They actually traded Jaden Daniels in a package, but I'll agree with you. I'll let you get to your point, but yeah, I mean, as good as he's been, I still don't think. Guys like him and Sam Darnold, who are quarterback 2 and 3 on the season, I still don't think that they're just like solidified week in and week out starters for your team. They're not locks. Yeah. And I also want to preface this, if you haven't listened to the show before, all boom and all bust teams, we do try to avoid the top players, at least for the booms. The bust, we could bust the top players, but at least for the booms, we do try to make it players that you might be thinking about. So basically, it's a lot of flex players and a lot of, whatever. So anyway, I'll let you get to your point on Jaden Daniels, who's been electric this season.
So like I mentioned, he's the QB2 overall in fantasy. And last week, he showed he's a great passer and a great runner. He had over 90% completion in a huge game going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Cliff Kingsbury, coach there a few years ago, knows the personnel. Going to know exactly how to tear apart that secondary. I like that combination for this game. I like the upside of Jaden Daniels rushing. He's had 10-plus carries in each of his first 3 games, 171 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. If he were a running back, he'd be in the top 24 just with those stats alone. So that's been great. The Arizona Cardinals offense is not great. They're not good against the run. They're pretty average against receivers. So the rushing upside there is going to be huge. And I know for a fact that Cliff Kingsbury is going to want that revenge on Kyler Murray in this matchup. So I think he's been electric up to this point of the season. I know it's only 3 weeks in, but we always say you don't need to be good at football to be good at fantasy football. It's looking like he's good at both. So he's looking a little bit better than your guys like Justin Fields for the past few years, where he's been a solid starter from that rushing floor. He's got it on the ground and he's got it in the air. So I'm locking him in very comfortably. I have a league where I have Jalen Hurts and I have Jaden Daniels as my backup dynasty. And I'm like, I don't know which one I should trade. Like, I can't roster both of them, I feel like.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually taking the other stud rookie from this class, and I'm taking Caleb Williams. And I will say, I'm not going to tell you to play Caleb Williams over your normal starter. Like, if you have a guy like Kyler Murray or Josh Allen or Hurts, like, you're not starting Caleb. Like, let's not get crazy. But I have a league where my 2 quarterbacks are Caleb Williams and Geno Smith. And Geno actually has a good matchup this week, too. So honestly, I don't know what decision I'm going to make, but I probably should go with Caleb since he's my all-boom quarterback. So yeah. Let's talk about it. Caleb Williams is facing the Rams this week. The Rams have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks in 2024, an average of 21.4. They also allowed the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks in 2023. That was with Aaron Donald. So the defense has not improved and are still allowing a lot of points to quarterbacks. The entire Rams team is banged up, both on the offensive side and the defensive side, mostly on the offensive side. But I know they got an impressive win against the 49ers. It surprises me, but also doesn't surprise me because McVay has had a lot of battles with Kyle Shanahan, NFC West battle. I could kind of throw that one out. This is not a matchup that happens often. Last week, Caleb Williams has had his best game as both a fantasy player and an NFL quarterback. 19.3 fantasy points in week 3, his first game over 10 fantasy points. It also looked like he'll be getting Keenan Allen back, which will be huge. The biggest issue that I think he's facing right now truly is that offensive line is terrible. Doesn't really have any run games to support him. The defense has been great. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think Odunze looked really good, and just getting Keenan Allen back on the field is really going to help spread that offense. So I see no reason why you can't put up another 19-point number. Kyler Murray had a great number against the Rams. Purdy had a solid number. The numbers here, Goff had 12.4 in week 1. Kyler had 28.5, which is his high this year. And Purdy had 25.8 last week, which is also a high. So I think it's a week where if you have to start Caleb Williams, if you're debating starting Caleb Williams, I think you could lock him in.
Nice.
Your first running back. 2 rookies this week. That's pretty cool. Your first running back.
That's a good start. I'm going with James Conner. He had 19.3 in week 1, 19.4 in week 2. And Nick warned us the Detroit Lions defense against running backs is electric, and they absolutely.
I'm going to talk about it again. The Lions defense is talked about every single week on the all bust team or the all boom team because good at some and bad at some, but they're complete polar opposites in certain ways. But yes, every single week that running back is going to be busted. I don't care who your name is. I'll let you keep talking. So yes, tough week for James Conner.
Yeah, and listen, like I mentioned, in the other 2 weeks, he's got over 19 points in each of those, and now he's going up against Washington, whose defense is horrendous. We've seen it for multiple weeks now. So I'm just going to tell you, don't panic because of a Detroit matchup, because Nick warned us all of last year. He warned us at the beginning of this year. I didn't listen to him. I got burned a little bit by it. But now I'm going to finally listen. I'm going to bench my running backs against them, and now I'm going to expect James Conner to bounce back in a very easy matchup.
Yep, that you play the matchups. I'm going to play a matchup here, and I'm going to go with Mr. Breakaway Speed, Tony Pollard, who I think is one of the steals of the draft, honestly. Tony Pollard so far through 3 weeks, he's had 2+ games of 15 fantasy points. The only game he put up a stinker was against Knicks Jets. And although their run defense is a little bit suspect, there's still a great defense in the league, and the Jets know how to shut down a terrible offense that is run by Will Levis. So it didn't surprise me at all that Pollard had a bad week 3. It doesn't scare me at all. Now going up against the Dolphins, who are just Tua-less, and they're bad without Tua. Like, that's just the reality of it. And that kind of makes me wonder what Tua's value truly is. But it feels like that team can't almost operate without Tua. Now, speaking about Pollard, the Dolphins defense has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to fantasy running backs in 2024, an average of 26.4 on the ground. The 3 running backs they faced, ETN with 9.9 points. The Jags are a mess. It's whatever. James Cook had 28.5. That was a high. And Zach Charbonnet, 25.7. That was also a high. By high, I mean highest of the year for those guys. So with all that said, play the matchup with Tony Pollard. They have to lean on this guy if they want to compete and win football games. This is going to be a Monday Night Football game. It's going to be very, very messy. Really, this is going to be a bad football game. But I think if the Titans do want to win this football game against a beatable Dolphins team, they need to lean on Tony Pollard, and they just can't expect Will Levis to go win football games, because that's not something that Will Levis is going to do. You're running back 2.
I'm going with Najee Harris. I feel like he winds up on one of these teams every week.
He is on this team every single week. Like, guys like him and Amari Cooper, and I'm not going to say it, but it's another one.
Oh, say it.
Well, he's on my team, so I don't want to say it.
Oh, okay. We'll get to it. All right. I got you.
But he is on this segment every single week.
I have a feeling I know who you're talking about.
I think you do. All right.
So Najee's been, to me, one of the biggest outliers for fantasy. He has 55 carries through 3 games. He has not been able to find the end zone, which has affected him being able to be a top fantasy running back. And obviously, you need touchdowns to get there. But let's take a look at some of the other stats from last week, which definitely helped out. So he had 5 catches, which helped his PPR number, something that we expected to see more with Russ, not with Justin Fields. But Justin Fields looks like he's going to be checking it down a little bit more. Now it seems like the game plan was to check it down a little bit more, which is great. The Steelers, they are just ground and pound. All they want to do is run the ball. That's the only thing Arthur Smith likes to do. And they got a very good matchup this week. They're going up against the Colts. And if you just look at your ESPNs or your Sleepers or your Yahoos and you see the ranking, it sounds like the Colts are a good team against running backs. No, they are not. That is purely because DeAndre Swift was up against them last week, had 63 total rushing yards against the Colts. But if you take a look at the first 2 games, the Colts were the worst rushing defense in football. They allowed a total of 237 yards on the ground per game in those first 2 weeks. So I'm expecting Najee Harris to have a huge game. And what helps even more for him is Jaylen Warren last week tweaked his injury from the offseason, and he's gotten much more upside now with all that workload, all that guaranteed touches. If he gets that work in the air and now touchdown upside against a Colts defense that has been suspect at best on the ground, Najee is kind of like my lock of the week. If I'm playing DFS, I imagine, has to be a great budget player.
Or if you want to play DFS and you go get the Joker, Cordell Patterson.
All
right. My second running back here is Jerome Ford. I think he's a guy who kind of lives on this all boom, all bust segment as well. Going up against the Ravens, the second most fantasy points, 2 running backs on average in 2024, 26.8 points. They allowed 22.9 to J.K. Dobbins week 1. That was a high. Derrick Henry had 16.6, which is a solid number. And then Chuba Hubbard had a high of 27.9 last week. Jerome Ford is also a double-digit fantasy points in 2 out of 3 games. I believe the only game he didn't was the game against the Jaguars. I think that was week 2, I want to say. Yeah. So with that said, Ford's been solid on the ground, and Deshaun Watson looks awful. Like really, like the regression from Deshaun Watson. There should be a 30 for 30 on this guy one day, and he won't be in the 30 for 30, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of interviews talking about everything. Yeah. But there needs to be a legitimate discussion about his regression on the football field. Take away the human aside, take away the cases. His regression on the football field for a young player, I think he's only 27 or something like that. That year off, or I think it was he was suspended or the injury, whatever it was, he's never returned to the player that he was before. And I don't think he ever will. So with that said, if the Browns want to win football games, they have a very, very good defense. Going against the Raiders, like this is a very winnable football game. Play good defense, won't run the football with Jerome Ford. That is their recipe for success. Your first receiver, who do you got?
I'm going with next guy, DK Metcalf. He has been elite in the last 2 weeks for football. It's been incredible. And if you take a look, The only reason why he's not higher in the wide receiver rankings is because he went up against Pat Surtain in week 1, who's been clamping everybody. Surtain 2 weeks ago played George Pickens, who scored 4.9 in that matchup. He's averaging over 12 points per game in the other 2 weeks. And Mike Evans, who had 3.7, who's averaging over 15 in the other 2 weeks. If you take away every wide receiver in fantasy football's worst game, DK Metcalf is the wide receiver 3 on the season, and you factor in that game had to come up against one of the best corners in football. Now, he's going up against the Lions, who are one of the worst teams against the wide receiver in football. So I'm expecting DK to get locked into lineups. He should already be locked in every single week, but I'm expecting him to have a week winning type of wide receiver 1, 2, 3 on the week performance.
I think DK will have a good game. I think against the Lions last year, I think he had like 6 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown or something like that. It was some kind of stat line.
Like it.
He'll have a good game. This is the Monday night game. Are there 2 Monday night games? Timeout.
There are 2 Monday night games.
There are
2.
Oh, good. Good. So there is only one game that we actually have to watch. That's wonderful. What times are these games at? The Dolphins game's at 7:30. The Seahawks game's at 8:15. Okay, and that's a little. That's like a little like appetizer at 7:30. It's like that's like the bread's on the table. That's okay. I think DK will have a good game, but I'm not sure he's going to be the Seahawks' number 1 receiver this week because I have Jackson Smith-Njigba on the all boom team. So. Like Nick already stated, the Lions have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers in 2024, a 35.9 average. 2023, they allowed the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So again, they have not improved. They've also allowed a lot of points to fantasy quarterbacks. So the thing about JSN, though, JSN plays a lot in the slot. He plays about 75% plays in the slot, and the Lions allow the 3rd most fantasy points to slot receivers in general. The receivers that have put up a ton of points against the Lions so far this season, Cooper Kupp had 32 fantasy points, plays a lot like JSN, possession receiver, plays in the slot. And then Chris Godwin, a total slot machine, 24.7 points in week 2. So those are the player comps that I have for JSN. In 2023, the Seahawks won 37-31 in overtime. I actually cut that game for CBS, and that was pretty cool. Geno threw for 328 and 2 tutties. I don't remember DK's stat line, but I did look at it when I was making my notes earlier. I think it was like 6 for 130 and 1. JSN had 5 for 34 on 6 targets. Tyler Lockett also had a monster game. In 2022, the Seahawks won 48-45. That might have been an overtime game as well. Geno threw for 320 and 2 touchdowns. So the last 2 times that these 2 teams have played, Geno's thrown for a lot all over. Like the defense hasn't changed for the Lions. So I know the Seahawks offensive line is banged up, and I'm worried about that. It's still going to be a lot of throwing from the Seahawks side of the ball. Also want to note from Mike McDonald, the Ravens played the Lions last year. They crushed the Lions. They won 38-6. Lamar had 320 and 3 touchdowns. So I think those Lions could be on upset alert. I'm just saying, but it should be a good game for both JSN and DK. And if you're playing DFS, I would take whatever Seahawks receiver has like the lowest value because it could also be a Tyler Lockett game.
Okay.
All right. Your wide receiver 2.
I'm going with Deontay Johnson. Last week, he looked really, really good with Andy Dalton. And, sometimes when you get the backup, you get the better game. But I really like this matchup for the Panthers this week. And then you have Thielen, who's injured, which is only going to help Deontay get more targets. You take a look at his workload last week, 14 targets, 8 catches, 122 yards, and a touchdown. That's a great stat line. Then you throw in some other factors. You have Deontay, who was a Steeler for his entire career, going up against the Bengals, a team he's very familiar with, having played in the division. And in those games, he averaged over 9 targets per game. This is an Andy Dalton revenge game against the Bengals secondary, who stinks. It's the worst that they've ranked in the entire time that Deontay Johnson was on between his Steelers career and now as a Panther. And I just think that if you take a look at it, you're going to have an absolute copy and paste week. It is going to be Deontay getting 10 plus targets. He might catch 6, 7, 8 of them, be close to 100 yards, and you hope for the touchdown. But either way, he offers a safe floor and a high ceiling.
My only concern is that I think he popped up on the injury report today. So I do understand and agree with Nick's points, but just, obviously with any player that we talk about, a player could pop up on the injury report on Friday. So just, again, monitor the injury report. I have George Pickens, who I think has been on our all boom and all bust team every single week so far. I'd have to double check that, but I guess the streak will live on. He's going up against the Colts, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers in 2024, a 33.8 average. Three wide receivers have already scored 17 plus fantasy points against the Colts through 3 games, one of them being Rome Odunze last week. Pickens has double-digit fantasy point games in 2 out of 3 games. The only game that he did not was against Patrick Surtain. The issue that's really stopping Pickens really isn't the talent, is that the Steelers are just winning football games playing Mike Tomlin football. They're playing good defense. TJ Watt is just playing out of his mind. He's going to be competing with Aiden Hutchinson for Defensive Player of the Year, the 2 early front runners. And they're playing good football, and they're winning ugly, gritty games. But Pickens is still the alpha dog over there. I think Fields is getting more comfortable in this offense. I think he'll continue to get more comfortable. DJ Moore is a top, 12 fantasy wide receiver last year. So there is still hope for Pickens as the season goes on, as that offensive line starts to gel a bit more. So I think this could be a good spot to play Pickens in your flex, especially with a ton of injuries. Devontae Smith, me and Nick will have some players that we want to bust on our all bust team. 4 of them, I would say, 4 to 6, depending on if you flex your receivers. So there will be opportunities to play Pickens, and I think he's worth the start.
Yeah.
Your tight end.
I'm really happy with what I crafted for my notes for this one. I think Nick's going to enjoy it too.
Okay.
I'm going with Brock Wright, and here's my preamble to it. The tight end position this year, it's been an absolute shit show. It's been a crapshoot of who to start, and now you got the Laporta potty hurt. The Laporta potty's hurt. It's been a shit show, a crapshoot. I love the lines, but let's get into it. Brock Wright, you got to keep in mind why Laporta was drafted early. It was because he was a rookie. He had an elite stat line in that season. He checked a lot of boxes: an elite offense, high scoring, touchdown upside. All those things were reasons why we wanted to draft him. The problem was the ADP. The performance has been a problem, don't get me wrong, but the ADP is the reason why he has not delivered. Now he's injured. He has not practiced any day this week. We're on Thursday, no practice today, and it's trending towards him being a bust. But for all the reasons we wanted Sam Laporta is a reason why Brock Wright needs to be started this week. Last week, 6 targets, only 3 tight ends on the entire season, averaged 6 targets per game. So he's got the workload from last week. You factor in it's an elite offense with high upside. Think about Dallas Goedert, tight end 1 on the season. Why is he the tight end 1? Because there was injuries in front of him to other skill position guys on the team. He's getting more of an opportunity, and it is what me and Nick have dubbed the best team for fantasy football. Now, the injuries, you can't control that, but it's exactly why we like guys like that and like that upside at the position. So with all the tight ends in this lackluster season, you got to shoot a shot on somebody. And right now, he's still rostered in less than 1% of leagues. Nick and I later on will get into our sleeper, a guy that's not really talked about anywhere that we like. He would have qualified perfectly for that. But I really think that he should be rostered in a lot more leagues at this point. And I think he will be when Laporta officially gets ruled out.
I have Dalton Kincaid, who I think a lot of people could also the tight end position itself has been a bust. If you think about Laporta, Mark Andrews, Kelsey, they've really all been busts for the most part. But I think this is a good bounce back game opportunity for Kincaid. The Ravens have allowed the second most fantasy points to tight ends through the season, 13.2 average. Last week, Dalton Kincaid had 13.1 fantasy points, his best game of the season with 5 targets. The Bills have also scored the most points this season, 112 points so far. Going up against the Baltimore Ravens this week, who have netted the most yards this season at 1291. So this could be a shootout game, could be a lot of points scored, could be a lot of yards scored. The Bills offense does seem like they're really going to spread the ball around. That makes it a bit more of a balanced offense. So it could be kind of tough to play your Bills on a week-to-week basis where you don't have a Stephon Diggs, who's really a target gobbling machine. But I think this is a good spot for Kincaid. And if you drafted him high, you're probably still playing him every week. You don't really have another option. So this putting him on the boom team is basically saying you could have more confidence this week and kind of not be worried about it. Your flex play.
I am going with Jawan Jennings. No Deebo Samuel, no CMC, no Kittle. It's
no
Brandon
CMC
Ayuk.
Probably for the year. I want to note that that's dirty business by the entire 49ers organization. I don't think he's going to play this year. Maybe it's a conversation for another day, Nick, but I don't think he's playing this year.
I feel like he's going to find his way out there later in the year, but I do think it's trending towards him missing significant time. I do think he should have winded up on the IR way earlier. I agree with you on that part. But getting into Jawan Jennings, last season he had an absolute field day. I don't know. I should have put the numbers in front of me, but it was an incredible day. He was the wide receiver one on the week. I believe it was 3 touchdowns, double-digit catches, 170-ish yards, like insane stat line for any receiver. And the factor is, he's a talented receiver that's a product of a great system. And that
12,
works.
175, and 3. I'm
Yep.
sorry,
Oh,
11, 75, and 3 on 12 targets.
Yep. So listen, it was a dominant week, and the advanced metrics for that looked even better than the numbers that Nick just read you. He had the most routes run on the team, snapping Brandon Ayuk. He had the most targets, routes run. That checks a lot of boxes. Now we have all these injuries. I don't think any single one of these guys is coming back this week. You factor in Ricky Pearsall is still on the IR for at least another week. Jawan Jennings needs to be in your lineup based on that last performance. They're going up against the New England Patriots, who earlier this year allowed DK and JSN to both combine for over 50 fantasy points. So Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Jennings, both of them could totally have a great week. And if you say that's an outlier, the other 2 games that they played were against the Bengals, where Yoshi Voss had over 15, Jamar Chase had about 15 in a game where they really struggled. And the Jets had multiple receivers go for double digits between Alan Lazard and Garrett Wilson. So I think that there is a ton of upside to Jawan Jennings at most weeks, but especially in a matchup against a team that allows wide receiver 2s to really outperform expectations.
So I think I had Terry McLaurin on my all boom team last week, and I think he had a pretty good game. They had like 15, 17 fantasy points, so that was a good coming out party for him. I have another commander, and it's Brian Robinson. I think he's a guy that's been on the all boom or bust team a couple times so far this year. Was really happy with his ADP this year, around 10 or 11. I got him in a league. Austin Eckler's out this week against a really bad Cardinals defense. The Cardinals allowed the 9th most fantasy points to running backs, a 22.7 average. They also allowed the most in 2023. Through the first 3 weeks, they allowed 13.3 to James Cook, 15.2 to James Conner, 16.3 to Jahmyr Gibbs, and then Monty 21.2. That was a high on the season. As for Brian Robinson, he has double-digit fantasy points in all 3 of his games. The Cardinals allowed the most points to road running backs since the start of 2023. And lastly, the Commanders don't punt. I don't think they've punted in 2 weeks or something like that. So you're talking about a team that is just not punting the football. That's a lot of snaps, a lot of opportunity on the field. He's the sole back on the goal line. I know they can run the option read with Jaden Daniels, but if I was them, I really would try to protect Daniels a little bit more. You really don't want him to take a ton of hits, even though he's electric on the ground. You don't want him to take a ton of hits. So they could really continue to lead on Brian Robinson, who's proven to be a bell cow. So I'm very cool with flexing him this week. I'm very cool with getting him in my lineups. I'd go out of my way to make sure that he is in your lineups this week, whether it's in a flex spot or a running back slot.
Just a quick factor on that too. Austin Eckler is concussed and that he's not been officially ruled out, but
I thought he was ruled out.
Dan Quinn said that he doesn't think there's a shot that he plays this week, but he's not officially on the injury report. But
maybe that's
the quote from the coaches, he's not playing. So it should be Brian Robinson's backfield.
Eckler's older anyway. Will Eckler take some touches and some catches away for sure? But Brian Robinson,
he stole a touchdown last week from Brian Robinson.
Yeah.
From Brian
you know who else stole a touchdown? Jonathan Taylor should have had 3 touchdowns last week, and it probably would have won me my dynasty matchup. But one of those touchdowns was robbed by Trey Mason. Was it Trey Mason?
Yep.
I forget who it was.
Trey Sermon.
All right, all bust teams. Who is your all bust quarterback for week 4?
I'm rolling out Anthony Richardson. And
this is going to be my all bust quarterbacks. This is one of the 2 that was wrong. I'm all out on Anthony Richardson this year. So Nick gets to take it away. But yeah, this would have been my number 1 choice.
Listen, he has sucked so far in actual football. And I know what I've told you and what I say like almost every single week. At quarterback, you do not need to be good at football to be good at fantasy football. But he has not been good for fantasy football either. He's not running enough for a mobile quarterback. He only has 6 rushing attempts per game, which you might say sounds like a lot for a quarterback. There's six quarterbacks that are getting more than that right now. Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, Daniel Jones, and Bo Nix. So that's the kind of category that he is in and under. He is not good enough there. And then he's not nearly accurate enough in the air to be dominant for your fantasy team. It's the combination of mobility and passing for Jaden, Lamar, and Hurts, and even Fields, who's throwing 73 completion percentage, that gives them good fantasy weeks. So you are now banking on him getting a big touchdown, which is or a big passing play, which is what he has done to be fantasy relevant in week 1, which we all loved, did not do as much in week 2 and sucked in week 3. And now he's going up against the number 1 team against the quarterback position in fantasy football, the Pittsburgh Steelers. So you're banking on a big touchdown pass from a quarterback going up against the toughest defense, who is not very good, who does not rush as much as he needs to. It is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all Nick's points. Obviously, I wanted to bust him as well. So,
Yeah.
but I'm going to go with another guy. I'm going to go with Matt Stafford.
Mm.
Big surprising performance on Sunday against the 49ers, but I think this one's going to be a little bit tougher. Going up against the Chicago Bears, who allowed the third fewest points to quarterbacks, an average of only 10. Quarterbacks since the Bears, we have Will Levis at 8.7. That was a low. CJ Stroud, 14.3. Actually, had Stroud on that all-bust team that week. That wasn't Stroud's low, but again, goes back to my point, Nick's point, at least before the season, that Stroud was really overdrafted. And then our guy, Anthony Richardson, a 7.1 last week, was also a low. That offense is banged up. I think they're down 3 offensive linemen. They're down Cooper Kupp, and they're down Puka Nacua. And as for Stafford, he's at under 15 fantasy points in 2 out of the 3 games. The only game he did not have under 15 was week 1 against the Lions, when he did have Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. So I think it is going to be the Kyren Williams show a bit over there for the time being. And I think it's going to be really tough to start Stafford without the offensive line, without Puka and without Kupp. And if they were healthy, Nick had them ranked as a top 5 offense before the season. And
Yep.
I didn't have him in my top 5, but I considered it. When they're all on the field, Kupp's going to get 20 targets. Puka's going to get 15 targets. Kyren's going to be great. If the line's healthy, like the Rams will be a very, very competitive and good offensive football team. But they've been not just bit by the injury bug, they've been infested by the injury bug at this point. And they need to get some exterminators to figure out a way to exterminate those injuries. But for now, Stafford to remain on your bench. I've kind of crafted the team this way. If you have Stafford and Caleb Williams as your quarterbacks, I would play Caleb Williams this week.
Nice. Perfect.
All right. Your first running back.
Go with Travis Etienne. I don't think I've ever put Travis Etienne on an all-boom team. He might be one of those not my guys, but I'm going to give you some stats for why I really don't like him and why this year has been awful. And we know the Jags have been awful, but Etienne is kind of getting away with some things for fantasy, and we're going to point it out now. In the first 3 games, he's not been great. Every game has been over 11, under 15. So fine, not the second-round pick that you wanted him to be, but he's been fine for fantasy. But what's most surprising about this is the Jaguars are not scoring touchdowns, and he has 2 touchdowns in these games. So if you're scoring a touchdown and you can't break 15 fantasy points as a second-round pick, that's a problem. That's David Montgomery at best, which is a 6th-round type of player. So on top of that, he's only averaging 67 yards on the ground, which is awful for a running back, and he's seeing over 70% snap share. So he's getting the time on the field. There's no excuse for him not to be getting higher production, yards per carry. He does not get nearly enough work in the passing game to be PPR relevant, which is where he was more dominant last year for fantasy. And now he goes up against the Texans, who are a top 10 team against the running back position. And last year, he was not good against them. 2 years ago, he was great. But the first time you saw D'Amico Ryans, his production on the ground went down 30%. So I'm not expecting Travis Etienne and this worst Jacksonville Jaguars team to beat D'Amico Ryans and play better when we watched 2 games last year, where his production was much worse there than it was in other games that they played in that season, and much worse than it was 2 years ago against the Texans. Every trend is pointing down for him, and he keeps needing to rely on touchdowns to keep up that over 10 points per game, which just is not elite enough for fantasy. It's safe, but it's not elite. That's not the type of player that's going to win you a league. So I am all out on ETN, but I really don't like this matchup this week.
The other thing that's hurting him is that Trevor Lawrence has been terrible. And the Jags have not won a game since.
Did you see the graphic comparing Daniel Jones to Trevor Lawrence and their career stats?
Yep, it's bad. Trevor's
it's
been bad.
Like perfectly in line. So everything you don't like about Daniel Jones statistically is in line with Trevor Lawrence. So,
and I do want to state I was anti Trevor. Me and Nick were doing our FaceTimes years ago when I lived in my own apartment, and Nick was like, "My Jets messed it up. They're not going to get Trevor. He's an all-time talent." And I was like, "I don't think he's that good, Nick." So I was out on Trevor from day one. That I thought he was a bit overhyped.
Nick's best, I think, football take ever was saying that every quarterback in the 2021 class would bust. And every single one of them has busted. It was Trevor Lawrence, it was Trey Lance, it was Zach Wilson, it was Mac Jones, and it was Justin Fields. Justin Fields looks to be the best one, and he's on his 2nd team in his 4th season.
Yeah, that's a bad
Every single one of them is on a different team except Trevor, who everybody agrees was overpaid at $55 million a year. So to me, Nick, that's your best take in the history of football.
Great.
5 quarterbacks in a draft.
Love it. There we go. All right. Running back. I am busting the Seattle Seahawks running back. And I say that because I don't know who's going to start. I think
I wonder
Kenneth
why.
Walker's practicing. I'm not sure, though, so it could be Charbonnet. But, yeah, Nick does wonder why. Maybe it's because the Lions have allowed the fewest points to running backs, both in 2023 and 2024. The 2024 average is only an average of 8 points. I busted Kyron Williams week 1 against the Lions. He scored 14.4 points. It really isn't that bad, but he did score a touchdown to save his day. I can't knock him for scoring a touchdown, but, without that touchdown, he did not have a good game. Rashad White had 3.3, also a low, and James Conner at 3.5, also a low. So all three running back ones that have faced the Lions have had their yearly lows so far. If it is Kenneth Walker, he's coming off the injury, and that's not good. I think it's a groin injury or oblique. I forget which one it is. If it's Zach Charbonnet, he had a good game last week, but he really hasn't looked efficient, at least when I've seen him play football. Again, he's going against the Dolphins last week, who allowed the third most fantasy points to running backs. But when I watched Zach Charbonnet play week 2 against the Patriots, he looked terrible. He was inefficient, and they started going away from the run because they couldn't run the football. The line is banged up. I think 3 starters are out right now. On top of that, Kenneth Walker had an okay day against the Lions last year. He had 17 rushes for 43 yards and I think 3 receptions, but he did have 2 touchdowns to save his day. So the Seahawks do like running the ball in the red zone, and that will be the saving grace if you are starting a Seahawks running back. But in terms of the production on the ground, it's not going to be pretty. I could see them abandoning the run pretty quickly and this being a shootout between Geno Smith and Jared Goff, which is exactly what happened last year and the year before that. Actually, the year before that, Rashad Penny had a ridiculous game. That was the Penny season. He had like 150 yards on the ground. All right, your second running back you were busting.
I'm going with J.K. Dobbins. He's going up.
I thought about that one too. It was not one that you stole from me, but it is one that I thought about.
So he's going up against the Chiefs, which are the 4th best team against the run. They faced Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, and Zach Moss. 3 great offenses, 2 really good running backs, and the guy in Zach Moss who's been much better in a role. And they're still ranked 4th, so they're shutting down top guys. And J.K. Dobbins, unfortunately, as much as I liked him pre-draft, it was always going to be a matchup-based performance. And the first 2 weeks, you saw it. The third week, you saw it. He plays the Steelers. He struggles. He plays bad teams like the Panthers and the Raiders. He is the top 3 RB running back on the season for the first 2 weeks. So now you go into a game where Justin Herbert re-aggravated his ankle injury. There's reports that he's pushing to play. I don't think they're going to do it. He's on bye next week. You might as well rest him, let him rest up for the bye week and get right for right after that. I know it's tough to do it in a division matchup, but you don't have Justin Herbert. You do not have you don't have a great offensive line. You have a good offensive line. And I know that it's a ground and pound system, but you can't ground and pound when the Kansas City Chiefs are up by that much to start. So I don't think that he's going to see as much usage as he should or as he has in those games against worse defenses. And he's not going to be too relevant in the passing game. He only has 7 targets this year through 3 weeks. So that's not going to be a recipe for success for him. So everything that it says is the only way that he's going to succeed is a touchdown. And I don't see the Chargers moving the ball down the field. And as much as Patrick Mahomes has been turnover worthy, has 4 interceptions through 3 games right now, the last 4 times that Mahomes has played this team, the Chargers, he only has 1 interception in that span. So he's not turning the ball over against this team. It's not going to put them in a position to score a touchdown on the ground. It does not look like J.K. Dobbins will have an elite explosive week like we saw in the first 2. Honestly, if you want, trade high now on him because there's still a lot of people that believe in him. Or if you really like him, wait until after this week and go trade for him on a bye week where someone might be desperate for a running back.
Another stat I saw about J.K. Dobbins earlier, I think the Chiefs are the number 1 team. Are they home or away this week, the Chiefs? Who's home?
I don't remember.
Let me look it up real quick. The stat was something along the lines of they're away. So the Chiefs, I believe, are the number 1 rush defense against fantasy running backs when they're the away team since 2023. I believe it was the stat that I saw. Okay, for my second running back, I had Jonathan Taylor. I think he's appeared on the All Bust team once already, or All Boom team. He's been around here. Facing the Steelers, who allowed the second fewest points to running backs, an average of 12. Bijan Robinson at 16.1 week 1. J.K. Dobbins at 8.4 week 3. That was a low. I didn't throw in the Broncos running back for week 2 because that was also a super duper low. The big thing about Taylor is Anthony Richardson stinks. So they're not getting to the red zone. They're not scoring enough points. And Richardson is taking opportunities away from him. So that's hurting his value. His targets are bad. 0 week 1, 4 week 2, and only 2 week 3. Again, Anthony Richardson stinks and is hurting his value. Gardner Minshew is better for Jonathan Taylor's value.
Yep.
Or Matt Ryan, like whatever quarterback, the Carson Wentz, whatever quarterback they've suited up for the past 4 years of Taylor's career, have all been better for his value than Anthony Richardson. He does have 3 touchdowns on the season, which is helping his stats a little bit, getting a little bit lopsided. He does have 2 100-yard games. That helps as well. So when they use Taylor, he's very productive. But again, if you're running back not getting any PPR value, that's going to hurt your fantasy points if you're not putting up 20 touchdowns in a season. So I think this will be a very low scoring game. This will be the lowest scoring game of the week, I would say. Maybe the Dolphins and Titans as well. Those will be 2 real stinkers.
Yeah.
This game you will not see on the red zone too much on Sunday. Scott Hansen will not be flipping to this one a lot.
It's the corner game.
Yep, it is the corner game. Your first receiver, who do you got?
You mentioned the Titans and the Dolphins. Well, let's bring that game right back. And I don't know if either of us have been bold enough.
This was it. I wanted to bust both of the receivers on the Dolphins, and I got told no. So here we go, Nick. Let's talk about both of the Dolphins receivers, not just Waddle, who was bad last week, as we both predicted him to be bad last week.
Well, here's where I go bolder. I'm busting Tyreek Hill.
I would too. I would have done both. I'm right there with you.
So listen, we keep busting Waddle, but we have not talked about how bad Tyreek Hill has been without Tua, and obviously without Mahomes. But how bad he's been with backup quarterbacks in career is not good. He has had 11 targets in the last 2 weeks. The best game he had without Tua, and I know Tua did play 2 weeks ago, was 7 points. It's trending towards the starting quarterback being Tim Boyle or Snoop, Tyler Huntley, who was not with the team until a week ago when Tua was hurt.
Yep, no Skylar Thompson, was arguably the worst starter last week.
It's either Skylar Thompson or Tim Boyle as the worst backup quarterback, and then you bring in former Pro Bowler Snoop, which I respect. But there's other advanced metrics which are not looking good for this week, and honestly for his season. He's only had a 75% snap share each week for the first 3 weeks of the season. So part of that is they're getting down early and they're resting their guy. Another part of that is Tyreek's older. He's running a lot of cardio and he needs more rest. It's a fact. And then you factor in that he's going up against L'Jarius Sneed, a guy who he used to play with, a guy who has shut him down in the playoffs last year. And it's not good. The Titans have been one of the 3 best teams against wide receivers. L'Jarius Sneed and Pat Surtain have been the 2 best cornerbacks against wide receiver ones in fantasy. So this is not a great matchup. I mean, he desperately needs Tua back, but when you factor in the other factors, this is the worst matchup that he's going to have over the entire course of the season. So
sure,
it is not good for that. And I wanted to say this, I mentioned at the start, Nick and I have done this show for 4 years. All boom, all bust has been a staple of the show. It's been one of the few things that have made it all the way through. I don't think either of us have ever been bold enough to bench Tyreek Hill.
I don't think so either.
I don't think you can bench him if you drafted him, but I would not.
It depends on your team.
I would not.
Our buddy Chris drafted Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Marvin Harrison. I think he had another one. I think he traded one of these receivers, but he was benching a top receiver every week.
Yeah.
Godwin. So there's a chance you're loaded at receiver and you could bench Tyreek Hill.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would not fault you for doing it. And it looks like Nick backs me up here. So
I would.
Let's bench Tyreek, guys.
Yep. My first receiver is a guy I had on the all boom team, and he kind of boomed. He had 15 or 16 fantasy points. And it's Knicks guy Garrett Wilson, who has yet another tough matchup. Going up against Pat Surtain in the Denver Broncos, best cornerback in the league. Going to shadow him. It's going to be a rough day for Garrett Wilson. I think he's totally taken out of the game. Broncos have allowed the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers at 14. That's the average. And Garrett Wilson has yet to actually crack 15 fantasy points. He had 14.3 last week with the touchdown. He's also yet to have over 60 receiving yards this season. So a guy that we thought and me and Nick both thought this wasn't just Nick with his Jets brain. I thought he could have Devontae Adams type numbers, and I know he's had some very rough matchups so far, San Francisco and Denver.
It's been he has played L'Jarius Sneed. He's going to play Pat Surtain. He played Christian Gonzalez, and he played Travarius Ward. He has played 4 of the 5 best corners in football, and he practices up against the best one every single time.
And the schedule will get better. Like, he will have better games, but this is going to be another tough one. All right, can you bench him? Probably not. There's a lot of injuries throughout the league. There's other worse matchups out there. Probably can't bench him, but he's on the bust teams. I think he's going to bust. Temper those expectations. You draft him as a top 10 receiver. I think he's outside the top 10 this week. And that's just that's the bust. Your second wide receiver.
You mentioned this guy earlier on the all boom team, but you didn't put him there. But I do think there's a case for him to all boom. I'm going to all bust him. I'm going to go bold. I'm going to go with Terry McLaurin. Very good game last week. But let's not forget the story of his career and the story of his season before that. For his big game, he had 4 catches, 100 yards, and a touchdown. And that's fantastic. That's some Brandon Ayuk numbers where it's 4 catches, a ton of yards.
Those are Amari Cooper numbers right there.
And a touchdown makes the week. So let's talk about it. The prior 2 weeks, he averaged 6 points per game. And Jaden Daniels has looked good for 3 weeks. He has not looked good for 1 week. Last week, he had the best game a rookie has ever played completion percentage-wise. He had over 90% in the game. Expect that to regress. Like, he is not maintaining that. No quarterback has ever maintained that. It's coming down to 65 to 70%. 70% would be very high. 65% would be great for a rookie. But for the Commanders to win in this game, it's run the ball. It's going to be running the ball against the Arizona Cardinals. It's going to be Brian Robinson, who Nick mentioned on his all boom team, and Jaden Daniels, who's averaging over 10, who has had over 10 carries per game in every single week. So Terry McLaurin is not going to see the DJ Moore type Carolina number where you're going to see 12 targets a week, 6 to 7 catches, and it's like either great or it's absolutely terrible. It's not going to happen. The number one guy that I could think of comparing Terry McLaurin to is Tyler Lockett, where very good receiver, but statistically does not always perform for fantasy. It's either a high target, high usage game with massive touchdowns, 30 to 40 points, wins you a week, or it's 2 for 4, 30 yards, and fine. Like, that's been the story of Terry McLaurin's last season, the year before that, and this season up until the massive game from Jaden Daniels. So you can play McLaurin because it's a good matchup. The Cardinals are literally, I think, 16th against wide receivers. They're dead middle of the pack, but it's just not good enough to boom. And when that happens, and he has been a boom or bust player, he's one of the least consistent players over the last 3 years for fantasy football. That's not good enough. And if I don't think you're going to boom, that means you're going to bust based off those stats.
I'm going to go with Zay Flowers, another guy who I think is going to appear on this team a lot, or on the all bust or boom teams a lot this year. Going up against the Bills, who allow the fifth fewest fantasy points to wide receivers at 8 and an 18.5 average. Zay Flowers has an under 12 fantasy points in 2 of his 3 games. The Bills also allow the 7th most fantasy points to running back. So I think it could be a big Derrick Henry game, a big Lamar Jackson game. It will be high scoring, so he'll get his. But the last time I put Zay Flowers on the all bust team, it was week 1 against the Chiefs. And he did indeed bust. I think he had under 10 fantasy points. So I would be weary of playing Zay Flowers. And I keep saying Mark Andrews is going to get going. Maybe it's just because I drafted him in me and Nick's league and that team's in shambles because of Pacheco. Yeah. Like I keep saying it. So, hey, maybe this week Mark Andrews gets going and it's the Mark Andrews game and not the Zay Flowers game. Your tight end bust. I had a tough time with this one, honestly. So I want to see.
You mentioned him just now. I went Mark Andrews. I think it's time to panic on him. The numbers have been glaringly awful.
I think you're right, but I'm just like in denial mode. I didn't watch last week, so nothing happened last week in my mind.
So let me tell you the shockingly glaring bad stats for Mark Andrews from last week. First off, he has 8 targets in 3 games. Last week, he only ran 6 routes in the entire game.
Oof.
He had the 3rd highest snap share from any tight end on the team. Isaiah Likely had the most, and I forget the guy's first name. His last name is Kohler. He's a great blocking tight end, and the Ravens are relying on run the ball. That's the way they want to win games. That's the way that they know how to win regular season games. That's the way they win against the NFC. It's the way that they perform great. And listen, that's going to work a lot of weeks. It's not going to work all. So Andrews eventually is going to have the 7 for 100 yards and a touchdown, and you could trade him. But I don't think it's going to happen here. And there's some other trends that have not been good for that. Isaiah Likely now is being used in 11 personnel, which is 1 tight end, 1 running back. That's where Andrews had thrived for fantasy football, where you had the 3 speedy receivers on the outside, you had the pass catching running back, and you have Andrews as your middle safety blanket. That's not the case anymore. It is the Likely show. And then when you bring in the 12 personnel, which is where you have 2 tight ends, 1 running back, he's not playing a single snap of that. So with Lamar ever audibles at the line, there's no shot Andrews is on the field to go catch a pass. So everything is telling you, if you take the name out of it, it's a waiver wire tight end, a guy that you drafted that needs to get dropped from your team. The problem is we're in denial because we've seen Mark Andrews be a top 5 tight end for 3 or 4 straight years. And at that production, points per game every single time he's out there. That's the only reason why he's on our rosters is because of name value. And I'm not ready to drop him, but I'm totally fine with benching him if you have a better option on your waivers, or if you drafted a good backup tight end. I don't think that is a hot take. I don't think the advanced numbers would defer you from doing that. I think it's time to do it.
All right. I know what Dallas Goedert, who is this year's tight end 1 on the season, tight end 1 last week, but now he's going up against the Tampa Bay Bucks, who allowed the 4th fewest points to tight ends, 3.2 average. They held Sam Laporta to a low on his season of 3.3 in week 2. Last week, Goddard had a great game without A.J. Brown, without Devontae Smith. But if I'm the Bucks, why would I not just double team Goddard if both guys are out and both are trending to not playing? If I'm the Bucks, why is my game plan not double team Goddard, try to make Barkley and Hurts beat us? That's what I would do, at least if I'm a defensive coordinator. So probably have to play Goddard, but he's not going to have 27 fantasy points like he did last week. And if he does, then I'm wrong.
Yeah.
All right, your flex play.
I had Goddard on the all bust team last week. We're gonna avoid that because he was the tight end 1 of the week with 10.
This could get bad then.
All right, this could get bad for both of us. All right. Flex. I mentioned his name earlier, DeAndre Swift. I mentioned him on the Tuesday podcast. I genuinely think he is the worst NFL player in the league that gets genuine game reps. Here's his first 3 games, Nick. He had 10 carries in the first game for 30 yards, no touchdowns against the Titans, who allowed a total of 200 plus yards and 4 touchdowns to the other running backs that he played against in the first 2 weeks. Next, week 2, 14 for 18 yards, 14 carries, 18 yards. If I told you 4 for 18, you'd say that quarterback had a great completion percentage. You're not saying a running back had a good game. Up against Houston, who in the first 2 games allowed 200 plus rushing yards and 3 touchdowns to the position. And then last week, his most embarrassing game, 13 carries for 20 yards and 0 touchdowns against the Colts, who totaled in the first 2 games 474 rushing yards against the position. There is 0 chance that you could confidently start DeAndre Swift. And again, like I said about Andrews, take the name out of it. I know it's really cool for all you Swifties and Kelsey fans that he has that name and that he was a Lion and he was an Eagle. Guess what? He is not good at football and he belongs on waiver wires.
Yeah, he's very, very bad. Like he is very, very bad. Okay. I am going to bust Alvin Kamara, which is very, very tough to do, who's been a top running back this season. Last time he played the Falcons, actually scored 43 fantasy points last year, just ripped them apart.
Jesus Christ.
But I actually just looked that up. I was going to try to use it. I'm sorry. I lied. That was against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Okay. He actually didn't play against the Falcons last game of the season. So the lone game he played against the Falcons last year in a PPR format scored 13 fantasy points. Actually, no, I'm sorry. He scored 15.9 fantasy points. I read all those numbers wrong because Fantasy Pro is a little wonky. But anyway, facing the Falcons defense, which is much improved. Matthew Judon, Simmons, obviously, and they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs, a 14.1 average. They held Saquon Barkley to his lowest number at 17.6, which is a really good number, but Saquon's been the running back 1 on the season. So it's actually a really, really good number. Stuff those Chiefs back, stuff Najee Harris week 1. And Kamara's banged up. He did get upgraded to limited on the injury report today, but he's actually banged up with multiple injuries. Let me read off the injuries real quick, because I actually did pull it up on Fantasy Pros. It's a hip and rib, but I thought he had another injury. I thought it was something with his ankle as well. So he's a bit banged up. I think the Falcons might actually dominate this game. And we'll see how it goes. I wouldn't bench Kamara, but I think he's on bust watch, and he's not going to put up the numbers that he has so far. So far through the season, he's the running back 22, 44, and 15. I think he'll be a lot closer to that 15 number than that 44 number this week. All right, before we get out of here, me and Nick are going to give you 2 players or 1 each that we think you might want to put on your rosters before this week. So you already had your regular waiver wires, but these are some deep waiver plays that you may want to pick up now before next week's waiver wire, and then you just avoid the rush. I did give you guys Bucky Irving, who is really close to emerging as the starter, now owned in close to 50% of ESPN fantasy leagues. That was my first one, at least. So we're doing our second segment here. We each have 1 guy, and they're owned in less than 30% of ESPN fantasy leagues. And Nick's guy is owned in less than 10%, and mine is closer to 25%. So I'll let Nick go first. And he's a guy that I think Nick picked up in our league this week.
Yep. So I'm back in my point, and Nick mentioned his Bucky Irving success. I mentioned last week Jalen Tolbert, 12 points after I told you to pick him up, owned in less than 1%. So we're gonna go with my guy. I talked about DeAndre Swift and how much he sucks at football. Well, I'm gonna talk about his backup. It's been a lot more efficient, a lot better. Roschon Johnson. The Bears offensive line, I know what you're thinking. They're not great. That's why DeAndre Swift sucks. We watched Caleb run. That might be true. But last year, the Chicago Bears were the second best rushing team in football. And it was not just Justin Fields. Khalil Herbert was averaging over 5 yards per carry behind this offensive line. And I know what you're thinking. Well, maybe they had offensive line turnover. No. They have 4 of the same offensive linemen. The only position that's changed is the center, where they seemingly upgraded because they spent the big bucks to go get him. Roschon did not play the first 2 weeks. He was dinged up. But in week 3, he averaged 3.8 yards per carry compared to DeAndre Swift's 1.8. And he saw 5 targets. He only played 37% of the snap share. But when you look at the efficiency and you look at what he did with what he was given, it's a lot better than Swift. I expect that Roschon Johnson is going to lap DeAndre Swift, whether it's this week or next week. I'm very much want him on my roster. I want him on my bench because he has that explosiveness, and he goes up against the Rams, who have allowed the 10th most points to the running back position. It is a stash play who has some upside if you need him this week, but he's definitely worth the roster spot on the bench.
I'm going with the guy, and I want to give Nick credit because Nick actually brought this player to my attention. And I'm stealing the take a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going with Romeo Doubs, who has the highest snap share of any Packers wide receiver this season. His stats have dipped a little bit with Malik Willis playing quarterback, but week 1 with Jordan Love, where all the receivers played, Doubs had 4 receptions for 50 yards on 7 targets. He led the team in targets. Jaden Reed scored the most fantasy points. He had 4 receptions for 138 yards and a touchdown. He did have a 70-yard reception that really helped with that number on 6 targets, but he was not the target leader. The other thing I do like about Doubs here is that during the offseason, Jordan Love was on a podcast, and they asked him to build like perfect wide receiver. And I think Nick might have brought this to my attention. Maybe I brought it to his. I don't remember. It was in our offseason show. Yep. One of our many off-season shows. I actually should stay. But basically, he talked about, I forget which players he named. Probably like Randy Moss and OBJ.
I can give it to you real quick.
There you go.
So he was asked to draw up the perfect play and to pick the wide receivers for it. For it, I believe he put Devontae Adams in the slot. He put Tyreek Hill on one outside as a quick player, but he put Romeo Doubs as his deep burner. So what he was telling you, what Jordan Love told you, was that's my favorite receiver on my team. And you see it in the snap share, you see it in the routes run, and you see it in the targets. The problem is you haven't seen it in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, because Jordan Love's been hurt.
Yep, and that's the bigger problem. So Love, I think, is limited in practice, or he's like questionable. He might play. I don't think he's going to play this week, but this might. I mean, if he does play this week, this is definitely the week to pick up Romeo Doubs. But you want to get Romeo Doubs on your team before Jordan Love plays and before there is a potential breakout. And again, the point of this segment is a player that you just stash on your bench. If they don't work out in a week or 2, you can just drop them, but you want to be ahead of the curve when it comes to these things, just like we said with Bucky Irving. So, and just like Nick said with Jalen Tolbert, who might be emerging as the Cowboys wide receiver too. So that is our show for this week leading into week 4. Hopefully we gave you guys a lot of information and a lot of players that can help set your lineups for week 4. If you still have other questions, which we're sure you do, since we can't talk about every single player, join our live show Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, available on our YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram accounts. YouTube is PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. I think the same as YouTube. I think Instagram as well. All 3 Primetime Fantasy Football podcast. The best way to watch that live show is on our YouTube. You will see how many questions are ahead of you, so you might have to wait a couple minutes as we give insightful answers to other people, but you'll see how many questions are in front of you, and then we can flash your question up on the screen when it does show up, and the chat can also chime in as well. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit the bell icon so you get notifications every time we go live, or when we do drop a new video, 2 videos a week available on Fridays and Tuesday. So make sure you subscribe to all audio streaming platforms. You consume the show on our audio streaming platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Make sure to give us that 5-star rating and a review. And then social media channels, like I said, Facebook is Primetime Fantasy Podcast, Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast, Instagram Primetime Fantasy Football Pod, and Twitter is Primetime FF Pod. Best ways to reach us during the week for also quick responses. Thank you guys for listening and watching and supporting, and we'll talk to you guys Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time for week